Good morning and welcome to the online devotion from Mount Gilead Church. My name is Mike Bridgewater and I'm the operations director here at the church building. And today is Friday, June 3rd, 2022. Last week we started looking at the three parables that take place the day after the triumphal entry. A lot happened on that day and Jesus cleansed the temple that day. And when we returned the next day, the Pharisees and the religious leaders were there making demands of him. Last week we looked at the first parable, which was the parable of the two sons, which is found in Matthew 21, verses 28 through 32. And we saw last week that the father was rejected by both sons. However, one later did repent and obey the father's request. This week, in the verses that immediately follow, we get to see Jesus tell another story, this time illustrating the rejection of the son. Notice in the story that we're still in the vineyard, and being in the vineyard had deep meaning to the Pharisees and the religious leaders that had gathered and that were listening. To shed some light on this vineyard story, do some self-study and read Isaiah chapter 5 today. So let's just go through this parable. It starts in verse 33, and Jesus is talking here, and he says, "Now listen to another story. A certain landowner planted a vineyard, built a wall around it, dug a pit for pressing out the grape juice, and built a lookout tower." We see here at the beginning this landowner, he plants, he cares for, he watches over and protects, and he expects his vineyard to produce some good fruit because he even built a pit to press the grapes. So what happens next? Let's read on. He says, "Then he leased the land to a tenant farmer and moved to another country. And at the time of the grape harvest, he sent his servants to collect his share of the crop. But the farmers grabbed his servants, beat one, killed one, stoned another. So the landowner sent a larger group of his servants to collect it for him. But the results were the same." Here in these verses, Jesus is making reference to some of the Old Testament prophets. At the beginning of Jeremiah chapter 20, we read, "The priest in charge of the temple of the Lord heard what Jeremiah was prophesying, so he had him arrested and had him whipped and put into stocks." In 2 Chronicles chapter 24, we learn about the prophet Zechariah, where he was stoned to death. In Hebrews chapter 11, the chapter, the Hall of Faith, we learn that some were sawed in half and others were killed with the sword. Jesus continues in verse 37 with yet another prediction of his death, which was only going to happen in a few days. He says, "Finally, the owner sent his son, thinking, 'Surely they will respect my son.' But when the tenant farmers saw his son coming, they said to one another, 'Hey, here comes his son, the heir to the estate. Come on, let's kill him and get the estate for ourselves.' So they grabbed him and dragged him out of the vineyard and murdered him." Then Jesus asked them two questions. First he asked, "When the owner of the vineyard returns, what do you think he will do to those farmers?" The religious leaders replied, "He will put the wicked men to a horrible death and lease the vineyard to others who will give him his share of the crop after each harvest." And then he asked a second question, which points them to Psalm 118, which they would have been very familiar with. Matthew concludes this chapter with, "When the leading priests and Pharisees heard this parable, they realized he was telling the story against them. They were the wicked farmers. They wanted to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowds who considered Jesus to be a prophet." So what's the takeaway for us today? It is this. The vineyard that was initially leased or rented to the farmers was a covenant of works. The new covenant that Jesus instituted through his death, burial, and resurrection later that week is a covenant of grace. And friends, that grace is still available today to you and to everyone you know. That's all I have for you today. Thanks for tuning in. You can read ahead. Next week we're going to look at the parable of the great feast from the beginning of Matthew chapter 22. This weekend, Jeff will be continuing the Tell Me a Story series by looking at a series of events from Acts chapter 16. I hope you're able to join us this weekend at either 9 o'clock or 10:30. Have a great rest of your Friday, and I'll see you on Sunday. Bye-bye.